It is not an easy subject to talk about. That's the subject of divorce. But when it comes to real estate, what are your rights in San Diego County if you own property and you're going through a divorce? Who keeps the homes? Who keeps the investment properties? Where's the line in all of this? And certainly, where is the law? We are going to jump into this today with local family law attorney Joseph Willmore. I'm Heather Myers with the Snyder Real Estate Group. Let's dive in. It is such a tough subject to talk about, but it's so important that people understand the law. So let's bring in family law attorney right here in San Diego, Joseph Willmore. Joseph, let's just jump in if you don't mind. What do people need to know right here in San Diego about their real estate when it comes to getting divorced?
So, Heather, I would say one of the most important things to know is any property acquired after you got married and prior to the date you separate from your spouse, that is going to generally be considered marital property, which means that your spouse, good chances, has an equal interest in that. So there's a number of reasons as far as how we can chip down that interest. Say there was a down payment that somehow stemmed from premarital property. In situations like that, you can always claim reimbursement to premarital, say, separate property that was used toward a down payment. But the general rule always is going to be that if property was acquired during the marriage, it is considered marital or community property, and your spouse probably has an equal interest in it.
And so when you say that community property, marital property, does that typically mean, unless there's extenuating circumstances, that it's split 50-50?
Generally speaking, yes. So that could include, of course, real estate is one example, but that also includes, say, savings during the marriage as well. So when we earn income from employment, a job, that generally speaking is going to be considered half your spouse's money as well. So again, we always look at when was it acquired. If it was acquired during the marriage, it is marital or community property, and your spouse has a half interest in it.
Now, what if the property is only in one of the spouse's names? I have seen that before where it's like one person in the marriage is on the title, the other one is not. Does that matter?
So it does not matter, unfortunately, because the court will look as to when it was acquired. And that occurs all the time where people will think that they've protected property and that it's only theirs because of title. It is very clear in the family code that title is not conclusive of any property interest. While it could be conclusive of, say, a bank's ability to go after somebody, for family court, it doesn't prevent the court from dividing that asset. So the court, again, is going to look at when it was acquired. If it was acquired during marriage, title is not conclusive of the other person's ownership interest.
Now, let's say you did have a property before you got married. Maybe you owned a condo or an investment property. Does your spouse have entitlement to 50% of that if they have been helping to make payments on it after you were married?
So generally, I would say no. So your premarital property stays your separate property. What your spouse's interest can be, I should say, your spouse can acquire interest in the amount that was put into that property. So that, generally speaking, is going to be principal pay down of a mortgage, or if the community makes improvements to that premarital property, such as there's renovations done, say new landscaping put in, that new spouse, of course, can argue that they've acquired some financial interest in those items. The burden's kind of on them, however, to prove what that interest is. So I would say the easy ones to prove: principal pay down of mortgage, that's very easy to calculate. As far as added value to the property, those typically are going to require appraisers. It could require some type of expert to come in and say, yes, these improvements added $100,000 of value to the property, therefore new spouse would have a half interest in that.
Okay, good to know. All right, I'm just going to keep going down the list here because we have so many questions in regards to what happens in California when in regard to real estate, and sadly splitting up. It's not an easy process to go through. Does the length of the marriage matter when it comes to splitting up real estate?
So the length of the marriage itself doesn't matter. I would say longer marriages, generally speaking, there's more exposure to additional properties that could be acquired. Generally speaking, for long marriages, there's going to be more equity in real estate as well. Although we're in very inflated times right now where prices do continue to go up. So even in these short marriages, there could be a lot of equity acquired in that short period of time. But long marriages alone don't mean that they have more property rights or more property entitlement.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting too, because a lot of people thought, okay, if you're married at 10 years, things can change, but it really doesn't matter when it comes to real estate. All right. Here's another question for you. Should I move out during the divorce, so before the divorce is final, or should I force my spouse to?
So nobody loves the answer to this one is that you cannot force your spouse to move out of the property, generally speaking, absent some type of domestic violence that has occurred. So if there is no domestic violence, you cannot force your spouse to leave. Now, what I advise clients to do is if they are in a bad situation, they are going crazy living with this person, and they have the ability to get out, generally I'll tell them, leave. For your mental health, you can go somewhere else. Leaving or moving out of the house certainly does not relinquish your financial interest in it, nor does it prevent you from trying to buy your spouse out of the property. I think another important thing to kind of tag off of this is if there is no agreement between the spouses as far as who buys who out of the house, it is almost a guarantee that the court will order you to sell and split that house. So if it's very important for you to keep a property, I always advise clients, let's bargain, let's come to the negotiating table, let's figure out what your spouse really wants as well to make sure that they feel like they've won something as well while you get the house.
Okay, that's good to know because I think that's important to point out. I don't think I realized this. You can be forced to sell this house by a court order if there is no agreement made, and a judge can sign off on that.
That is absolutely correct. And a kind of a scary thing
Yeah.
or a scary reality of going to trial is the judge doesn't care about emotional attachment to property. All the judge is looking at doing, quite frankly, is equally dividing all of the assets. And again, in highly contentious cases where there's, people just want to fight for the sake of fighting, I would say trial, unfortunately, in those situations is your only option. If you're willing to settle, if you're willing to concede and compromise on issues, you will almost always get a better result because going to trial, they're just going to cut every asset in half versus trying to settle cases. You're able to say, okay, well, I'll buy you out of the house and you can have a little bit more of this, where you're able to manipulate a more creative settlements to where you're not just cutting things in half, but you're really making practical solutions for your life and for your situation.
In expensive San Diego County, do you see it very often, Joseph, where one spouse is able to keep the property and pay the other one out half the equity, or does it really just depend on a case-by-case basis?
I would say it's truly a case by case basis. Of course, there is a lot of wealth here in San Diego County, so there's plenty of people that are able to do that. While at the same time, we have a lot of people that are, of very modest means or living paycheck to paycheck. I will say that for when I look at a financial situation, of course, I'll tell my clients to also speak with their tax preparers, financial advisors, and of course, realtors as well, to make sure that this is something that they can make sense. And in those situations where it's impossible for one side to afford the house while still buying out the other person, the practical reality of that situation is they would need to sell the house and split the proceeds. And actually, one case recently, I think this was a great result for my client as well, is that in quite frankly, there was a lot of compromise on both sides here, where wife wanted to keep the house, and also husband didn't want the children to have to leave their childhood house as well. So the only way that my client could afford to do that was for husband to stay on the mortgage, while also, of course, signing a quitclaim deed. So he's off title to the house, but he did agree to stay on the mortgage until the youngest child turned 18. So that's allowed my client, of course, to keep that ultra low 2.7% interest rates, which made her able to keep the house versus getting a rate at, the current rates today, I believe right around 7%. She wouldn't have been able to do it.
Now, and I think that's so interesting that you point that out, because I actually have some friends of mine that are in a similar situation to that. If they decide to do that, is there something written in there that when that youngest child, as you mentioned with your particular clients, turns 18, that she has to then sell, or that his name comes off the mortgage, or where's his role in all of this once that kid is 18?
Yes. So what happens in that situation, for example, is that when the youngest child does turn 18, I believe in that situation, it's about 7 years away. So a good amount of time. In that situation, my client has the obligation of refinancing the house if she does not want to, or she also has the ability to sell the house. The house is hers. Her obligation at that point is either to take husband's name off of it if she does not want to or is unable to do so. In that situation, she would have to sell the house.
Okay. Okay. So down the line, she has some heavy decisions to make, but at the moment,
Yeah.
this worked out. It sounds like for both of them in that particular situation.
Yes, absolutely.
This is kind of interesting, and I think we have a little bit touched on this, but this is a question. I let my spouse keep the house, and now I regret it. Our divorce is not final yet. What options do I have?
So this question sounds like the spouse only has temporary use and possession of the house. So in that situation, if your spouse is just living in the house while the divorce remains pending, you actually didn't sacrifice anything or relinquish anything, because property division does not occur until your divorce is done, either by way of settlement or trial. So simply letting your spouse live in the house while the divorce is pending and while you're trying to work through issues, you have not given up anything. You have not relinquished your ownership interest in it, and you certainly have not relinquished your ability to try to buy them out.
Okay, so nothing is set in stone until the judge has that final
Yeah,
signature.
there's nothing set in stone until you either have a signed marital settlement agreement or a judge has made orders on it.
What other advice do you have for people? I mean, the heartbreak of going through a divorce, whether for some people it may be a relief and a heartbreak at the same time. But when it comes to real estate in expensive San Diego, it can just get so overwhelming. What do you tell your clients like right out of the gate?
Well, this is a, a tricky subject, I would say, and it truly does vary based on situation by situation, because we see things concerning real estate, as you real estate professionals also know as well, where there's substantial emotional attachment to houses, as well as there can be a lot of bad memories depending on the complexity of the situation, or, for example, there's domestic violence that may have occurred in the marriage as well. There's a lot of sensitivity to real estate. I always advise clients, of course, not to make decisions based on emotion or anger or maliciousness or simply wanting something or not wanting something just because your spouse also either wants it or doesn't want it. You always see those situations where somebody knows, well, I know they want to buy me out, but so now I want to buy them out too.
Sure.
And we're going to fight about it. And if you kind of learn some of the facts of their situation, you learn that they actually don't like the house. They don't like the neighborhood. They're just doing it because they know it'll upset the other side. So it's really important for me as a divorce attorney to really kind of get into their minds as well, to see, well, what do they really want in this situation? And ultimately, what can I do to get them in the best situation after this as well?
What do you tell people who are considering separation, maybe considering walking down that road of divorce before they even call you? What do they need to have in order as far as paperwork goes when it specifically comes to real estate?
So specifically when it comes to real estate, as far as kind of having all your ducks in a row, so to speak, you want to have access to all mortgage statements. You want to roughly have an idea of the value of the property. It's nothing prevents a person, of course, from calling up financial institutions, having an appraiser come by the house to value the house. Of course, calling up realtors to learn about comps and so forth. That's certainly within everybody's ability to do. So I certainly always encourage people to do that investigation, learn as much as you can. And quite frankly, there's a lot of clients that I have that have no idea what assets they have. And in those, whether that be real estate, investment accounts, et cetera. And I always say, do as much investigation as you can to figure out what exists. Ultimately, that's my job to find the rest, whether that be by way of subpoenaing everything to find out what may or may not exist. But certainly do your investigations. If things are still reasonably amicable between the spouses, ask them as well. Certainly within your ability, contact your own financial professionals, such as your CPA. A lot of times you can learn a lot by the professionals that you utilize as well, especially if one spouse has been in control of the finances and the other person has not.
Anything else that people should know, Joseph? You mentioned before we even started this interview, that one of the things that you are suggesting to the majority of your clients now is to hire a private judge. How does that work?
So an important component about hiring a private judge is it's kind of twofold. Number one is every case you will always settle at least some issues. And hiring a private judge essentially entails you have a very experienced family law attorney and former family law judge that is handling your case. Now, spinning through the family court system right now to get a trial date oftentimes takes a year and a half, sometimes 2 years even, to get that opportunity even before a judge. A lot of times, and depending upon whether we just cycled a bunch of new judges in recently, which means they also don't know family law. And that can cause, mind you, judges, I believe, always try to make the right decision. But in certain situations, judges are people too, and they get it wrong, especially when they don't know the laws and generally the factors that the court consider. And hiring a private judge certainly ensures you will have somebody who's very experienced, very knowledgeable about the law, and the result you get will be very predictable. Chances are your attorney will have already told you the likely results, because family law, generally speaking, is pretty predictable. When we look at, say, real estate, for example, it's very easy to figure out the spouse's interests in real estate, or we just base it on what the property is worth. Was it marital property, and is either spouse entitled to some form of reimbursement, such as, for example, like a separate property down payment. So chances are we can already figure it out without litigating it before a judge. I would say of all issues that are very predictable, property division is extremely easy. It's those very sensitive issues such as child custody, support, spousal support, child support. Those issues, there can be a lot of deviations, and those are more litigated issues. But certainly real estate, it's always in everybody's best interest to settle it, because chances are you will not do better before a judge.
Yeah, good, great advice. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know it's a hard time when anybody's having to go through this and the splitting up of a family or the splitting up of a relationship, but I think you really helped people with some concrete advice, and I do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Heather.
Local family law attorney Joseph Willmore, we certainly appreciate your expertise. Again, I'm Heather Myers with the Snyder Real Estate Group. If you have any questions about buying or selling property here in San Diego, don't be afraid to reach out. My contact information is right there on the screen. Thanks.